I think what I would say is your students want to succeed, and they are, for the most part, making an effort towards that. Incremental growth, incremental change is really worth celebrating. And if you're listening and watching and you see the students move the needle just a tiny notch and you go nuts because they've made some growth, that goes a long way to just, I think, reinvigorating their interest in doing more.
Welcome to Director's Circle, a podcast featuring insight from music educators and school leaders discussing their philosophies on the administrative leadership of a comprehensive music program. I'm Doug Conrad, and today's guest is Dr. Philip Silvey from Rochester, New York. Let's begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Director's Circle. I'm Doug Conrad. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to subscribe to the show on applications on your phone. Yes, you can grab it right now and join. You can subscribe to the show on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, and iHeartRadio. You can also look us up and follow us on social media on Facebook under Director's Circle, as well as looking up our accounts on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So if you've checked out a lot of the music education podcasts out there, I'm sure that you've come across a great one called the Everything Band Podcast, hosted by my friend Mark Connor. In every episode, Mark talks with composers and educators about the topic of work-life balance. And a lot of the times those people really give great insight from being a full-time composer to even being a full-time educator. Well, my guest today actually has the distinction of working in both of those fields. His name is Dr. Philip Silvey, and in addition to being an acclaimed composer for choral groups, Dr. Silvey is also an associate professor of music teaching and learning at the Eastman School of Music, where he also directs the women's chorus and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in music education. So, without further ado, here's my episode with none other than Dr. Philip Silvey. Hello, Philip. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you here. So, to start things off, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Sure. I grew up in central Pennsylvania in a pretty rural area and had a good musical experience with my family and in school. And that sort of led me to studying music at Houghton College, which is actually not far from where I am in Rochester right now, where I studied music composition and added music education. As I tell our students now, I was an adder, which means that happens sometimes, actually pretty frequently, that students decide to pursue the teaching certification. So that's part of my story. After that, I went directly to Penn State for a master's degree in music composition, which the opportunity presented itself. It was probably one of the first grown-up decision I had to make. Between taking a job, I interviewed for a job that was open in the middle of a year because I took a ninth semester to student teach. And so I applied for a job, interviewed, and was offered that job teaching in Pennsylvania. And I then also had applied to grad school and was accepted and offered an assistantship, which is also unusual to have that happen in the middle of a year. But I chose to go to Penn State and had a great experience and earned a master's degree and did some substitute teaching, in some cases long-term substitute teaching. In fact, at the school where you attended in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, was one of those. And that was where I really started developing my skills as a teacher, and I applied for a job in West Michigan in a town called Allegan, which was near Grand Rapids, where at the time I had two siblings living. And that's where I got I really learned what I know about teaching during those years in the 90s. And then because of my experiences as a music teacher, I wanted to know more, and that set me back to grad school. I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And after that, I looked at jobs that I was prepared for, and I anticipated teaching college, but I hadn't set out necessarily with a clear idea of what that might look like. But the jobs that were open and that my profile suited are the ones that I pursued, and I ended up taking a position at the University of Maryland for 6 years, and that's where I learned how to teach teachers in more formal ways. And after that, I took another position at a school outside of Cleveland, Baldwin Wallace University, it's called now. And then from there, I came to the Eastman School of Music, and this is my 10th year here. So all of my college teaching has involved some choral conducting and has involved courses that are in teacher preparation, essentially, we might say, and then graduate advising and graduate course instruction at University of Maryland and here as well. So it's kind of my professional journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's certainly a lot, and it's really neat to hear that we have a common background. They always talk about 6 degrees of separation, but actually you had a long-term subposition where I went to high school years apart. But that's really neat, too, that both of us did grow up in central Pennsylvania. So what town specifically did you grow up in?
Well, I was near Huntingdon, PA, but the actual town was Alexandria.
Oh, okay, so Alexandria, Juniata Valley High School. I could talk about that place all day.
My father was the principal of the elementary school, so we were very involved with the school.
Yeah, small world. So anyway, as you were talking a little bit now about your current work in Eastman, some of it works with training music education majors, as well as some of the aspects of choral conducting. So could you talk a little bit about your specific duties and your current role and what you're doing in the school year at Eastman?
Sure. I do what I think a lot of people who are in choral music education positions at the university or college level, and that is I do some conducting and I do some methods class teaching. So my particular load includes a graduate class in curriculum that I teach periodically at that level. And right now I'm actually chairing our department, so I oversee kind of help organize our graduate colloquium and our doctoral seminar. So those are my duties that deal with graduate students. But I have historically in my time at Eastman taught 2 choral methods classes, one geared for elementary and middle school, and the other aimed at secondary or high school. And I am now currently in my 3rd year of teaching a choral arranging class, which we might talk a little about. And that's been a very interesting undertaking. And I direct the women's chorus. So it's choral methods classes primarily that I'm teaching to undergraduates, and those are the classes where, in our case, in our situation, they are juniors or seniors, and they're pulling together all the skills they've been developing in their other classes and trying out the experience of teaching. It's very field experience based.
Yeah, that's a lot, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about what you do with your music education majors at Eastman too, a little bit further in the interview. But to talk about specifically on your work as a composer and arranger, you had mentioned that that is originally the track that you had started in. That's something you are still keeping up with in your career, and then later on you added the teaching component as a focus in your career as well. So could you talk to us a little bit about your work as a composer and how you got into composing music?
Yes. It's part of my profile and my identity. It's kind of how I see it now. And I would say I didn't really get into composing, that it just was in me. It was something I discovered about myself. And we might think of I tend to think of the whole human experience as one of self-discovery. So I think that manifested itself when I was a kid and practicing piano for half an hour every day as required. And actually we had a wind-up timer that clicked, and the piano was in the living room in the middle of the house. And I would, when no one was looking, I would cheat it. I would move it ahead 5 minutes. So practicing piano was kind of a boring, tedious thing, and that's common. So I think part of that is what inspired me to be inventive at the piano and make some things up. And that's really all I do is I make up songs at the piano. So that turned into writing songs, and I did some co-writing with my brother, and we would perform in church and record ourselves. And I went to the Pennsylvania Governor's School for the Arts the summer after my sophomore year in high school, and I met some other composers, and actually it was the first time I ever publicly performed one of my compositions. And I wrote a song when I graduated. I wrote a song that I sang for that graduation ceremony. So I really kind of think of myself mostly as a songwriter and certainly a vocal-focused writer. And because I studied piano all my life, piano is a big part of it as well. So those are pretty evident in my choral output, the publications that I've been doing more recently. But I think composing was a way for me to assert my uniqueness. I'm from a big family. I'm one of 10 children, and so I found I'm the only one that composes, and it was a way for me to distinguish myself. And that's kind of been an important value of mine all my life, is just to basically, I'm attention starved. So it's a way to call attention. But the creative element, the idea of creating something that, especially in the arts for me in music, that could impact somebody else, that could move them, make them think, stir them in some way, that's pretty powerful. There's a lot of appeal in that for me. And just to kind of touch on your question, or the idea of me adding music education, and we may talk more about how the two interact, but what I found is that my composer identity, which was always there, just started manifesting, or I found ways for it to come out and be part of what I did as a teacher as well. So it's come out in lots of circumstances where the ability to compose or arrange has served me as a music educator.
So to touch on that topic a little bit, could you talk a little bit about how your work as a composer has affected your work as an educator, or even as a teacher trainer in your current position now? Or has there been anything vice versa, being an educator, does that influence your work and your current compositions in any way?
It's a great question, and they both influence each other actually a lot. So the influence on my work as a composer, I think, comes from just having a sense of what it's like to teach repertoire. And so when there are things that make a piece more learnable, more accessible is a word that some people like to use, just more gratifying, I think, for the singers themselves and for the format of what a typical school choir is like. And I realize there are church choirs and community choirs and children's choirs and adult choirs. So there's really a lot going on in the choral scene. But for me, I'm thinking primarily of school choirs. So I write with the real situation of a classroom and the learners that are developing in schools in mind. And so that just affects the structure of what I do. I try to do things that are innovative and interesting and have expressive and artistic distinction, but also that are doable, maybe is a way to say it, or that provide opportunities for students to develop as musicians, as singers, and as human beings. So in the reverse, what I find is that when I'm selecting repertoire, or in current years teaching choral arranging, how to create repertoire to students, that I think about, I look inside of a piece more closely, perhaps because I've built them. And that's the same thing that happens in the choral arranging class. The students are trying to create a piece, and it causes them to look at repertoire differently. So I study a score. I understand how to take apart a score, maybe, and think about how it's the form and what repeats and what changes. that's sort of the reverse of what you do when you're building a piece, is you're trying to create that from the structural sense of the originator. But if you're analyzing it in terms of, do I want to program this, or what appeals to me about this? So there's a lot of overlap. I feel like I'm better at choosing repertoire because of my work as a composer, and I'm better at composing because of my work having taught repertoire, selected and taught.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned about writing, especially is a term I believe you use along the lines of accessibility to certain levels of performing ensembles. So if you could talk a little bit about, and this could even go in with maybe some aspect of your teaching career. So if you were to compose, if I were to commission you for a piece for a 4-part middle-of-the-road high school choir, and then if you were to compose a piece commissioned by one of the leading groups at Eastman, would you approach writing for each group differently? Would you have specific skills or concepts in mind that you might program more for one than the other, or anything like that nature?
Yeah, it's a good question, because commissioning organizations, or a person commissioning, does set the parameters, help set the parameters at least, and I usually negotiate those, the ones that are negotiable. But certainly I would write differently for those two groups, and I would take into account the abilities of the performing group that has commissioned the work. I will say, as most composers, I look ahead to the piece having a longer life than just the premiere, and so I scale it to what I think would be a category of choirs. So if I'm writing for a college choir, then I could write in a way that other college choirs might perform the piece. The works I have that are most successful actually transcend that a little bit. I have some pieces that are written for treble voices, and children's choirs have done them, college women's choruses have done them, adult women's choruses have done them. It tends to reach that far would be more likely either treble or lower voice type of a piece. And the same thing, though, that it works nicely if you have a piece that's that versatile. But I've done a number of commissions where I was scaling it to the abilities of, as you said, an average or maybe just a less experienced high school choir.
So, with the rule, too, of being a professional composer, in addition to your work during the day as an educator, it certainly requires a lot in your time and your energy and a lot of aspects of your life. So, with that said, can you talk a little bit about how you balance a career as an active educator and composer with everything you do?
So, I've learned about myself that I'm not really a schedule-driven person, but I'm more of a project and a deadline-driven person. And I learned this, I think, primarily in graduate school when I was working on my dissertation and writing scholarly writing projects. So I had a professor who would say, she got up every morning and worked for 2 hours on her writing. And I've heard of composers. I've read some books. Composers tell their process, and they schedule 2 hours in the morning, then they have coffee or whatever. So that's not me. I will be driven by the ideas, and they'll be kind of brewing. And really, in a lot of ways, I'm carrying them around all the time. But I will carve out time. I like small bits of time over, repeat sessions of sitting at the piano and working, and I jot some things down. I don't even use notation a lot in the beginning. It's just sometimes I just write the letter names of notes, or I might take a staff and write a couple notes really quickly, but just to remember ideas as they develop. So that means composing fits in around other things. And sometimes I'm into it and more than others, and I just have to kind of be responsive to that, which can be problematic if you don't have a lot of time to meet a commission deadline. But I found a way that I think works. So the other part of my life, which is teaching related and the other pursuits of an academic person, are structured mostly by the teaching schedule, and I have some regular recurring meetings that I think frame how my week works. So I don't really have like a 9 to 5 job, and it's not like public school where you get to school at 7:30 and you're there till 4:30 or often lots later. But the things that are locked into my schedule kind of help structure it. And I add things to that too that are more about me and how I want to live my life and taking care of my fitness and things like that. So between the two, I would say I still focus on projects. What am I doing? What do I want to accomplish? What am I working on at this moment? And aiming to finish in a timely way. But again, the composing happens in small spurts, I think, lots of repeat visits. And then towards the end, there's usually some marathon work where I'll get into that zone where I'm just saturated, and I'll go for 5 hours when I'm entering it into my software, for instance, which comes late for me. And when I'm then tweaking, and I'll say just a little more about my process. Often after I get it set into, I use Sibelius, I'll print it out, and then I'll take it down to the piano, and then I'll use a red pen to mark that up, and then I'll bring it back up to the computer and rework some things. And it goes back and forth like that for a while. So, and even after a piece is premiered, there's changes like that. So, but there's a lot of think about time too. Like I said, I'm carrying it around all the time. This is composer Jeff Beal, who wrote the music for House of Cards. If you're familiar with that, his work, he does a lot of soundtracks. He's a Eastman grad, and I've heard him give some talks. And he talks about think about time, so that where it's gelling and you're kind of forming ideas away from really any sound making devices. So it all fits around each other for me. It's not scheduled. So I don't know if that's a good answer or the right answer to the question of balance, but it's a balancing act of sorts.
Yeah, and that's a unique thing that you talk about with deadlines and all that stuff, because a lot of times, I especially know in my undergraduate experience, there was some compositional components of the curriculum, but one thing that a lot of people, unless you're really starting in the profession and really dealing with that with other commissions or publishers or whatnot, is the aspect of it too as a business on that side. So could you talk a little bit about just how that might work for someone not as familiar with that? Let's say you've had a piece commissioned, you're approaching a deadline. How does that look? Or let's say if you were to publish a piece through a major publishing house like Alfred or the like, from the time you actually have some sketches down, you're on a computer, what does that side of the business look like as you're approaching maybe that deadline, or as you said, times of where you're really in those spurts, spending some more time on that project than others, just approaching that just to be on that side where you deliver a product to whoever it may be?
Yeah, the answer to that would be, I'll try to be succinct, but there's lots of dimensions to the business part of the work I do as a composer, because I am interested in, to me, I feel like I'm writing curriculum when I publish a choral work, and that means more people can access it and use it. And I hope for meaningful purposes in their classrooms that will have some educational value to the students who sing the pieces. So that being said, the commissioning work, which is often mostly what I do now, is really just fulfilling the agreement that I made with the person who's commissioning the work. And oftentimes I'll try to send them a preview or send them a close to the end draft and say, what do you think? Am I on track? How do you feel about this? And I'll just say this too while we're on this, that my belief is that when you commission a work, you're actually not commissioning a work. You're commissioning a composer to write the next work. And so if you think of it like that, then it's less of a expecting somebody to really do a custom. I say it's not like ordering drapes. It's you're saying, I want you to write a piece because I'm an admirer of your work, or I think your work is appropriate for the ensemble. But I encourage you to think of it as letting the composer have what they need to to just create the next thing they're creating. But I try to negotiate that even before I accept the commission, that I say, here's an idea I have for the project. Are you excited about that? I just finished a work for treble choir. That's my rewrite of the Serenity Prayer. I'm calling it Young Person's Serenity Prayer. And so I pitched that to the commissioner, and she was like, I have the Serenity Prayer is on my bathroom mirror. That's fantastic. I love it. And once you get that sort of energy going, and I like to do that even before I agree to the commission, but once that's happening, it's just a matter of meeting their expectations. When you're looking at business in terms of, will this be published? That's another step that where you send it to a publisher. If you get a good recording at the premiere, that's extremely helpful, but often I've had to arrange to find someone else who will record it with their choir, or I put together choirs to do recordings. You want to send the recording tells the publisher that this piece works with singers. It's an important piece of it. And then you have to get the editorial board or the editor. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a group of people, to agree to publish the piece. And then there's the longer answer goes into promotion. And once a piece is published, you want people to make use of it, and you have to. Their publishers have their ways of doing that, and then with social media now, I've been doing some of my own independent work to try to spread the word. But again, I think of it as curriculum, that I'm providing musical resources for teaching.
Yeah, and that's really unique to hear, especially with this specific topic of you composing an original project. But something I know you had mentioned then too was that you also teach a course in vocal arranging. So to speak on the topic of arranging a little bit, or and maybe how it might be opposite than the process or considerations given when making an original composition. So as a composer, what are your thoughts on the roles that arrangements play into repertoire selection for ensembles as opposed to original compositions?
Yeah, it's a question I'm just beginning to explore more. So I will say, I think of my own work when I compose an original piece really as writing a song that I do then eventually arrange for choir. That's often what happens. So other than the fact that I generated the melody, they're very similar processes. But for my teaching of choral arranging, I've learned that there's the step of finding or choosing the tune, the pre-existing tune, and then all the things that you can add or change in the course of turning it into a viable choral arrangement. And I was excited to teach the class because I thought this is a creative class. And for the first time in my teaching career, really, I'm teaching a class where the goal is for each student to create something different. It's like an art class. And I was excited about that. But what I learned was that more of what the students needed help with or needed to develop was their ability to craft an arrangement that was well constructed, and so this course has taught me how to compose and arrange. I've developed my own senses of that much more strongly because I'm coaching people who are trying to do it, and I'm seeing sort of where all the pitfalls are. So it's less about the creativity than it is about just being smart to write things that people can sing easily, that they can access. But I did want to say that I gave a presentation recently, and I consulted the two publishers primary publishers I've been working with for the most years would be Santa Barbara Music Publishing and Carl Fisher Music. And I asked them to search their catalogs. And by the way, neither of them publish, or I think if they do, it's rare that they would publish a pop song arrangement or a musical theater. They tend to do what would be called concert music. So they both did a tally, and it was essentially the same. 40% of their catalog was arrangements. So I would say I tried to do a guess, that I maybe program one arrangement per concert on average. It would average out to about 4 a year, maybe something like that. So it's less in terms of how much it comes out in my own choices, but it's pretty amazing to me that there are that percentage of publications from two publishing houses would be arrangements. So, I'll just say that I think what's great about arrangements is they get people singing tunes that have been around for a long time. They get them acquainted with a tune that originates from another time, originates from another culture. There's lots of things that these tunes carry. And I'm actually, for the first time in my life, I'm conducting a concert all of arrangements. It's all American folk songs and American folk hymn tunes with the women's course that I conduct. And I'm calling it, I'm changing what I'm calling it every week, but I'm referring to it as tunes that carry us and tunes that we carry. And so there's something about certain tunes and the familiarity of those tunes and what they represent. And so celebrating them through arrangements, through an art form that allows for some creativity, is like looking at the past through a new lens. So I think it's fascinating. It's causing me, this particular concert, to think more about the arranger's process and what an arranger can bring to turn a melody into just a really fine choral performance arrangement.
Yeah, and it's really neat to hear that, especially in the choral world, that such a large percentage of what's available in those publishing houses are arrangements. I know for myself, as a saxophone player and as a instrumental music educator, a lot of when you're in the instrumental realm, you talk arrangements. It's either something that may be for a more educationally focused performance level, or something that's more of a transcription as like an orchestral piece to be played by the wind band. So it's really neat to hear that plays a large role in the choral idiom as well. So now to talk a little bit about your work as a teacher trainer, especially at a school like Eastman, which is regarded as one of the leading music schools in the world. So in your role as a music education professor, obviously you work with a lot of people who are going back for post-bachelor degrees, or even future music educators that are finishing up their undergraduate curriculum. So as a teacher trainer at Eastman, what are some of the biggest things that you want your students to be equipped with before they enter the profession?
So I should start by saying that we don't really use the term training for teaching. It's just it's a little bit of a semantic thing, but we, I guess we would say teacher preparation. And I'd also like to say that what I've learned, because I've been doing this now for 20 years, is that there's limits to what we can impact during the time a student is in our care. And the college students that I teach, I advise them, but they really only have a couple classes with me. Now they have 3 classes with me, so it's even just a few semesters worth of influence. So there's some limits to it. But one of the chief values of our department, which is, we call it the Department of Music Teaching and Learning, that's a relatively new change, is that our students develop musicianship skills. And what that means is that they can, I think, thoughtfully and knowledgeably look at music written, and also do this orally, perform with a sense of how it's built, how it's put together, or perform with understanding. So rather than maybe parrot or just, drill and kill in their rehearsal, they really understand what's happening musically. That's pitch and rhythm, how things are related, how things function, just how it works. So we actually hold the students accountable for that as an entrance exam, and actually as sophomores, where they demonstrate skills. It's the kinds of things that often students in music study learn in their oral skills classes. We just value those, and we value them for a specific reason, I think, because your musicianship leads to good music teaching, because you know how to take apart the learning challenges of well-written musical pieces. You know what are the fundamentals. You know what makes it tick, and rather than just start at the beginning and go through, you have the tools and I think the skills to take it apart. So musicianship is prime primary in our department. I would say for me, I think of teaching as leadership, and that includes things like decision-making and organization and communication, the ability to motivate people, which is something that's become more and more clear in my mind, even though we still don't have a course dedicated to it. But a lot of what we do in teaching, and particularly in music teaching, is we can't, I don't believe we can literally motivate someone else, but it's to provide a place where they feel motivated, where they become self-motivated or intrinsically motivated. And I would say the last thing is I like to send students into the classroom with this ability to self-reflect. So there's a cycle of planning, teaching, and reflecting. And so when they take a class in methods, they go through that cycle with help from me. I give them lots of feedback. But in the end, you spend a lot of time alone in a classroom when you're a music teacher. Nobody's watching you. Nobody tells you whether what you're doing is a good idea or not. So the skill I think they need is to self-reflect, is to honestly look at what they're doing and be able to say, what could I do better next time? Because that'll help them to continue to develop long after they've finished our courses.
Yeah, it's really intriguing, and I really enjoy hearing you talk especially about motivation, of motivating students for different intrinsic and aesthetic purposes. So could you talk a little bit more in depth about that, just whenever you might have that lecture or two, whenever you go over that with your students? Are there specific things you talk about, things that might motivate students in the performance-based ensemble setting?
Yes. This is, again, not fully formed, but I will say that the two researchers, DC and Ryan, who actually, they're not, DC is retired, I think, but they are the developers of the self-determination theory, if you've ever heard of that. And it's the belief that intrinsic motivation arises when, this is a very sort of simplified statement of what they believe. There's lots to it, but is that people will be intrinsically motivated if three basic needs are met. And those needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I do this in some of my methods teaching. I translate that into these three things. When I'm in a classroom, I need to understand who's in front of me and what they care about. And so knowing those students well and meeting them where they are is important. But when I'm trying to take them somewhere, I'm wanting them to develop a skill, I'm wanting them to grow in some way, they need to know that they can do it. So the first thing is, you can do this. So that's competence. So that means when they try something and it's not perfect, we still have to feed their sense of, you can do this, rather than letting them get carried away in some kind of a self-doubt, which is common. So that's an important one. The second thing is autonomy, which is, this will help you. So my first is, you can do this. The second is, this will help you. And what I mean by that is, whatever I'm asking you to do is going to benefit you long beyond our concert or making me happy in this minute. And so that means I have to choose carefully what I ask them to do. But if I ask them to do something that's going to benefit them in their life, and I highlight that, I think that will cultivate their sense of autonomy. In other words, autonomy really means in some ways that they have a choice. And so if you present this as something they're choosing to do because it's helping them, I think it can help. And then the last one is, I'm here to help. So you can do this. This will help you or benefit you, and I'm here to help, which is relatedness. In other words, you're not doing this alone. We're all working on this together, and I'm going to assist. So, you're in relationship with me as your teacher. And I think if we can feed those three things, then there's more likelihood that the student will not be motivated out of fear or out of some whatever external tool we might use, but actually be motivated because the the activity itself is feeding them in some way. I think we can do that pretty easily in music, especially if we pick interesting repertoire that feeds back to the learner. The joys and the inspiration that comes from making artistic, interesting sounds together with other people.
Yeah, and that's really neat that you then tie that into the repertoire selection, because I know in one of my previous interviews with Frank Battisti, one of the biggest things that he advocated for was, even aside from what we do in the performance of our ensembles, is really just getting kids to love music and to building that lifelong love of music. And I would really be interested to hear, especially with your input as a composer as well, let's say if you were to program music for a 9 through 12 choral curriculum, and maybe I was to go through that curriculum with you in one of your ensembles, say at a high school, what types of music or what types of things would you think about should be included in the music curriculum to maybe help a student build a love for music, to see the wider breadth of what music can bring to their life, or anything of that nature?
Yeah, that's another long answer if I really answered it. I'm actually developing ideas about this as we speak as well. I think those repertoire choices are so critical. It's the most important musical decision that we make, and it is the curriculum. It is our content. Now, a lot of times we look at it as instructions for what to do, like sounds to make, the right sound at the right time. And I think we also all in the field of music education understand that we want those sounds to collectively mean something or express something or represent something. So, I think we know that it's more than just, let's just get it as right as we can. But I know for the choral world, there are a lot of options. In other words, there are, I would say, hundreds. Well, let's say there's got to be maybe not all in print, but let's say 30,000 choral options. Now, there would be less when you're talking about picking a particular voicing. So how could you possibly narrow that down? Well, some of the beliefs, and my belief would be variety, and introducing things into students' lives that they wouldn't encounter otherwise. So that means going into historical things. That means going into art music that they might not encounter otherwise. One of my favorite stories was teaching a De Lasso piece to high school students, and then weeks later leaving school and walking by the car of a brother and sister who were in one of my classes, and they were listening to what sounded like Baroque choral music. And I was like, what are you listening to? And they said, they held up this CD and it was all De Lasso. And they were just like, we liked that piece. And so they bought this CD. So, I felt success in that because I was the person who introduced that into their life. So I think we have an obligation to do that. But what I'm learning more and more is that we can be really strategic about those choices. And so, like I said, I'm doing a concert of all arrangements right now. So I'm actually thinking of this as a unit I'm teaching. These are college women, and there's community women involved in the chorus as well. But the unit to me is melody. We're talking about what makes a great melody and how are melodies structured. And so we're analyzing the melodies that these arrangers have taken. And then we're looking at what is the arranger bringing to this? I actually printed out some of the melodies just by themselves. And in fact, in the concert, I'm going to invite the audience to sing some of the melodies. So I'm using this as an example to say, cluster the repertoire around a theme or an idea. And I don't mean a theme like a marketing theme, like we're going to do a concert and everything has to do with sun or everything has to do with night. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but that's not a curricular theme. So a curricular theme would be, again, having a question. and I'm engaging the students in the chorus right now, and I asked them to all tell me a tune that was meaningful to them in their childhood, and we're coming back to these tunes and relating them to the tunes that they're learning, trying to make it relevant. Just a couple other quick examples. I did a concert for choral singers 2 years ago where there was no text in any of the pieces, and these pieces were all different styles and from different time periods and different cultures, but they all had neutral syllable type texts. One was jazz scatting. So the question we explored was, how do humans express themselves through sound and not language, not words? Because we have text in choral settings, but we can, in this case, there was no text to interpret, no text to discuss. It was, we do what instrumentalists do all the time. So that was an example of me gathering the repertoire around an idea that would be something we could keep hitting throughout the 6-week rehearsal cycle that we have. So I hope that's answering your question. The idea of how would you go about choosing repertoire for high school, I would say determine what you want them to learn and pick a set of pieces that will all in some way hit that, and then make that a focus for the period of time that you prepare that repertoire, like a unit.
Yeah, it's really neat to hear, especially with that perspective of a curricular mindset then, too. So now, to keep with the topic of music education, into our next question, especially in the unique circumstance where you had actually taught for a while where I went to high school. It was sometime before I graduated, but even, I reflect on where I went to high school. It was a great school, but even to when I go back home and visit my parents over the holiday break in the winter, the things with the school, even just the campus has changed a lot. Maybe the model of the educational objectives of the school, and they're doing fine and dandy for the record, by the way, but we can look at any school, especially in the past 20 or 30 years. A lot of things have changed in the way schools function, and not even just music programs in particular, too. So, with that said, then, with your teaching profession, and even maybe relating it back to some of your undergraduate teacher preparation, as you said then, too. With that said, and keeping in a mindset now where in school settings there are many things going on with testing or educational initiatives and the like, what are some of the current challenges in the music education profession that undergraduate students feel that you feel should receive more training on before they enter their first job?
It's a good question, and it's one that we think about in our department when we're tweaking and working on our curriculum. In other words, how do we prepare teachers for what they really need in this day and age? And I will tell you, things have changed a lot from when I was in undergraduate to what we do now. I should also say that when I taught, it was the 90s. So that's my real world personal experience as a teacher. But what I do have an advantage of now is that I've been partnering with schools for the choral methods classes I teach, so middle schools and high schools. And in both, I've been in more than one. In both cases, we repeat with some of the teachers. But so in other words, I've been in classrooms for enough time right now to have a sense of what's important or what might be changing. But the other thing I also like to do, and I just did this recently, where I encounter a former student who's been out teaching for 10, or in this case, he's been teaching, I think, 20 years. And I asked him, what has changed in your time as a teacher, and what do kids need right now, or what's important? And so I have some ideas from that. But I will say some of it I would have said 10 years ago the same thing. And I think undergraduates or future music teachers, pre-service as we call them, learn to teach by doing it, by experience. So I think one important thing is to keep them in front of real school kids whenever possible. And it's not always possible. There are a lot of big programs, music teacher education programs that are large, and it's mostly peer teaching because there just isn't a way to do that. we're fortunate at Eastman to have class sizes that allow me to have choral methods classes embedded in a school setting, and the students all teach once per week. We're out in the school for 10 weeks. So that's all prior to student teaching. So with supports and with a sort of sort of increasing steps, they develop more and more skills. They teach longer segments. So that's my first thing, is they just need opportunities to teach. In reality, they're not going to develop expertise for about 5 years, according to Bob Duke. So we're just this tiny window of preparation. But I think giving them experiences is an important thing we can do. And if we can give them experiences in schools right now, they are going to be prepared for what they're going to encounter, because these are real schools. I think culturally, the current youth are impacted by social media and by that way of interacting. And this conversation I recently had with a former student, students are craving relationship. They're craving somebody who cares about them, who sees them, who relates to them, not through a post, or a meme, but actually has a conversation with them. So I think that's an important thing, that communication skill. So when we are in schools, I encourage our students to develop relationships with the students, and that's why we stay in one school rather than having them jump around and get samples of other schools. The last thing, we talk a lot about technology, and there's still trouble, I find, in figuring out how to include that in how we prepare students. But I will say this, that because of the internet and access to searchable information or crowdsourced information through social media, there's lots of potential for that resource to be useful to teachers. A great example is YouTube. You can literally find a YouTube recording of almost anything that's published of a school age group performing it. You can hear what it's really going to sound like. And that wasn't true a while ago. So that's the upside of it. The downside of it is we're inundated with too much. Info glut, I think, is what one author calls it. And so what I feel the skill students need is the ability to search with focus and the ability to discern when they've found something that's a good idea and when they haven't. So if you crowdsource for an idea for repertoire from one of the Facebook groups and you get 15 ideas, how do you pick which one of those is the right choice for you? Do you take the first one that somebody gave you? Or so having the skill to sift through all of that, what's available through essentially through the internet and through our phones, I think is an important skill. I'm not sure how we can teach it, but it's one I've started to try to address in that choral arranging class. Is how do you find a good recording or a good example of a performance that isn't a studio made recording by a publisher, but that is a posted recording of a school group. So using those recordings in smart ways, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really unique response, especially with looking out at the real-world performance of the recordings versus professional ones, too, especially. So with that being said, too, in terms of ensemble-based performance music classes, a big topic that has come up into discussion at professional development seminars, especially I know as an instrumental teacher in roles of where it plays into student accountability with a class especially, is the role of assessment. So could you talk a little bit about on your thoughts towards the role assessment plays in an ensemble-based music class?
Yes, that's another important value of our department, is that when we assess the students' learning, we're able to adapt our teaching. We teach better, basically, if we're good at assessing what's happening. I would say for the choral music students that I prepare, they are developing formative assessment tools. For the most part, that is while they're teaching, they're watching, they're listening, and they're asking. Those are the three chief ways they can assess. So what visually cues do they get from the students? What are they hearing? And that's one that takes some time to develop. And then asking is just simply whether it's a question or allowing the students to generate some form of an answer to help us know what's going on in their heads. As one of my graduate professors, Eve Harwood, used to say, making their learning or their thinking visible. We want to know what's going on in their heads. And so that's a big reason for doing these types of assessment. I think in terms of more summative assessment, or more what we would consider a formal assessment, one that we do, we don't even think of it as assessment often, is our approach to auditions, when we sort of gather information about what a student can do. But, I have encountered teachers who get students to volunteer and sing alone, and they sing in small groups, and they do activities during their rehearsal process that allows them to assess the students' abilities and their quality of their voice and their skills, because they create an environment where the students feel safe to do that. That's hard to do, but where volunteers will sing alone, in other words. The other thing that, when you talk about grades and issuing a formal assessment of a student, I would say there are things that we can test. There are skills or some basic knowledge, but oftentimes we tend to choose that because it's easy to test. But I used student journals, particularly with high school, and they would be open-ended, and sometimes they would be with prompts. And it wasn't like a booklet they each had, but it was sort of an exercise in writing, and I would take 5 minutes in class. And that, I learned a lot from that, and I learned a lot about what they cared about and what they were thinking about. Same thing can happen with discussions. But when it came time to grade, I did allow students to self-assess and sort of mark skills based on the things that I valued. And then it's much harder, but trying to collect data, and I know there's a lot, there's been movements towards having more data-driven decision-making for teachers. So recording the whole class, or having students record themselves. Years ago, Jean Ashworth Bartle wrote in a book about passing a tape recorder during a rehearsal, and then she would have a brief snippet of assessing each child in a children's course, Toronto children's course. I think I've heard of teachers having students use their phones and just record themselves during a rehearsal and then send the file. So those are ways that would be more time-consuming to literally assess, but it certainly would be some information that you might have trouble getting when it's a large ensemble, and it's hard to do individual assessment in that setting. But those are some of my examples. I'm sure there are others that have better ideas, and practicing teachers that are developing these kinds of things more fully.
Certainly, and I really enjoyed hearing about the variety of assessments that you had discussed. And I know from a clinic that I had went to at the Midwest Clinic just a few years ago is by Paul Kimpton, where one of his biggest things is assess what you value and value what you assess. And much of it, comes down to the priorities and even own philosophical beliefs of the conductor. So with that said then too, you had talked about a wide variety of, whether it be through some reflecting and journaling, if you will, to even something that's big now that I even use in my own classroom is through applications that can record. There's a one out now called Flipgrid. Other people use Schoology or the like, basically to record themselves, whether it be for the student to self-reflect on their performance or even for the teacher to evaluate that performance. But let's say then with all this type of data or even varied forms of assessment, if you were to step back into a high school choral classroom as a director, how would you utilize this assessment maybe to strengthen the level of your ensembles towards their music making?
Right. It's a good question how do you channel what you gather, the information that you gather. I think the ability to hear what's really happening is students are challenged because they're so concentrating on what they're doing. So I do think it's an advantage for them to listen to themselves being recorded, which I did do when I was a teacher, actually. Not on a regular basis, but from time to time. And we actually listened to other recordings of other school groups, and that was harder to get my hands on at the time, but I had a way. And then I would record them and listen. They would listen to themselves, and it was interesting for them to hear the two, another high school choir and then themselves in comparison. But yeah, I think I would do playback and discussion, or have them note some things. Probably try to focus what they listened for in a particular listening. Maybe set some goals, record, and then listen to see whether we felt like those goals were met. I actually had a student in one of my classes do that exact procedure. He actually collected all their responses and summarized them and created like bar graphs and things to show what the general consensus was about how well they did.
Certainly. So another big area then and this is probably one of the things that, as you had mentioned, just really with learning by doing, if you will, in the profession, is the topic of musical advocacy. And there's a wide spectrum that advocacy can cover, aside from just saying why music is important, but there's so many things that can affect, whether it be resources, financial, or even decision-making in schools. And with that said then, especially now, how we talked about change in educational institutions, especially in the past few decades. What are your thoughts on music advocacy and its importance to a music program?
Yeah, I actually like to pose the question when I'm talking about advocacy: what if we didn't have music in schools? Could we survive without it? Is it necessary? Is there a better way for students to spend their time? And I think it's realistic to be able to I think it's realistic to say that might be the case. Because I always feel like when I talk about music, when I try to advocate for music in schools, that it's out of self-interest. I'm a music teacher. I'm preparing music teachers. I want it to be there for them to have. So, but as I've thought through my own philosophy and explored that with other students, humans make music, and they're musical in some way or another. And we know this. If you watch the Grammys last night, I mean, there's music everywhere, all kinds, and lots of people are pursuing it and spending money on it. So that wouldn't stop. But I think my belief is that we want to contribute to the depth of the experience that a person might have, and again, the variety, like those two brother and sister who were introduced to something they wouldn't have known. That's because of music education. And then I also think the experience of being in an ensemble in particular, or even in general music classrooms where you're making music together with other people and you're coordinating, you're literally like lining things up and getting in sync with people and making things fit together across people. It's just a metaphor for that kind of cooperation that can be useful in all kinds of ways in life. But I do think we're naturally musical. It's part of the human experience. Our interest is in trying to help improve the quality of people's lives. If you're in education, that's what you're doing. And music is a really great way to do that. I think it's a great way for people to be artistic and expressive. And I think you can have, if you think of the word amateur, which is derived from Latin, meaning for the love of it, people who just do something because they love it. You can put a lot of amateurs together and really have some great music making experiences that are a valuable use of their time and an opportunity for them to live out their artistic selves, be artistic. So particularly choral music, I feel like you can just show up and open your mouth and we'll help. You don't have to have an instrument that you've learned well enough to, that's the difference. When I do guest conducting and I address the audience before the last number I conduct, I always say, nowhere else in the school do we ask students to use their minds and their bodies and their hearts in conjunction with each other and all at the same time. So there's the intellectual part, there's the physical skill part of music making, and then there's this expressive part. So I do think that's a unique thing that we do in music in particular. It would be true of dance and theater as well, just a performing art. Anyway, that's an extra piece there.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking about the perceptions and perspectives on music advocacy, and even one unique perspective in my interview with Scott Lang was he talked about one of the biggest things, even aside from what you could say in a concert or in a pamphlet about what music can bring to the benefits of one's education, is also just what we see visually whenever we advocate, and specifically to the numbers in a program, especially when it comes to decision making, where if I see a lot of people in one function of the school versus another, obviously a lot of my decision making will gravitate towards a lot of even where the numbers lie, or even where the priorities that those numbers tie in with the learning community at large. So with that said, then can you talk a little bit about maybe how with that in mind you could approach building and recruiting numbers in a music ensemble?
So to answer the question about recruiting, I always say that the quality of a program or the quality of the work that you do with the students in your classroom is really the best recruiter. And that has to do with the outcomes, such as concerts, but it also has to do with the kinds of experiences that students have, because they talk. They talk to each other, they talk to their friends. And so I found, and I'm not a good salesperson, and I wasn't a good recruiter in terms of having recruiting techniques, but I felt like I tried to do something in the classroom that the students were excited about, and the word would spread by word of mouth, really. So that was done, I would say, by excellence, just doing something at a high level of excellence, and also relevance. So for me, relevance was visibility. So looking for like the homecoming football game or a pep rally at school, somewhere where the whole school would see evidence of what we were doing, and pick those carefully. So try to make it, those would be the ones that could be more relevant. It might be a more contemporary or well-known piece that's arranged well for choir in this case. And I think just being proactive in talking to students, and you might research which students have been in music in the past and try to revive that. But yeah, I mean, I actually also have a feeling that bigger isn't necessarily better. I know this runs contrary to the point you were making, but serve who comes, when you're in an elective class, and do great things with that group. And maybe it doesn't need to be any bigger. And maybe you don't need to have as many low voice singers as you do high voice singers, which is a common argument for recruiting, tenors and bass, people to sing tenor and bass. Maybe you don't have that many. And so you got to be creative about programming, and it's doable, serve the people who are there. So, but again, I think if you work with who you have and you do something that's well done and successful musically, that people see that and they're drawn to that.
Lots of good points there, Philip. So now to move on to some questions that we ask every guest in each episode, could you describe one or two of your favorite rehearsal tactics?
Yeah, I will. I'm going to kind of not answer this directly, because I don't really think of rehearsal techniques, tactics. I think of them as strategies, and they always come out of the blueprint of the piece itself. So I think they're custom made, or the best ones. I will say two things that I advocate, which is under tempo rehearsing, because I feel like I've never had problems increasing a tempo. And actually there's research that supports the idea of a pianist rehearsing a difficult passage, actually slowing down but making no mistakes, actually using rubato and then getting back into tempo at the moment of the challenge. And that's a technique that expert practicers use. The other thing I say now that I didn't say before was meter in the body. So anytime I'm looking at the score and I hear the choir rushing, or I hear the choir out of sync with itself, I will look up, and invariably their bodies are disengaged. And so if we get the meter, whatever the meter happens to be, somewhere in their body, and they can feel it and see it across the group, it solves that. It syncs things up.
Great. So then I know we talked a little bit about this before in terms of advocacy, but especially in terms of philosophy of music education, if you were to give a 2 to 3 minute response, why do we teach music in schools and what is its importance?
My short answer is what's actually in the latest 2014 version of the National Core Arts Standards, and that's artistic literacy. So we call language literacy the ability to read, the ability to make sense of printed text. And so artistic literacy is like that. The quality of our life increases tremendously when we can learn to read and have access to reading. So it's like that. When we learn to be artistic or artists, we can make more sense of the artistic world. And I'll just summarize from Jackie Wiggins, who writes about this and says, music literacy is more than just reading notation. So it's that we understand and are comfortable with a variety of music, that we find meaning in music, that we understand how it's expressive. We understand the role it plays in our lives. We can be musically independent, and that we value music. So music literacy to me is the reason we teach, is to cultivate those levels of the values of music that people naturally are drawn to just deepen those and enhance them.
So throughout your career then, you've had many different positions and have worked with a lot of different individuals along the way. So if you had to take a few of your most inspiring leaders in your personal or professional career, who would they be and what lessons have you taken from them?
Yeah, I'm going to probably depart here a little bit because there's certainly many people in the field of choral music education and in music education that are admirable, but I have in the past thought about and asked my students to think about what I would call influential teachers. So I'll tell you a couple stories of those. So one was my high school English and Latin teacher named Sally Laporte. And she was a worldly in the best sense. She just had a real good sense of, she was a traveler and she was, understood culture. And I grew up in a very farmland kind of a country. And she would tell us, when you're in Paris, as if we were all going to be there the next week. We didn't imagine we'd ever be in Paris. I was in Paris and, of course, thought of her. So, she was inspirational in that sense. And she was her own person. She was bigger than life. And this is kind of what I've seen in the teachers in my life that have been most successful, is that they are just unafraid to be themselves. And so I always admired that about her. I had another professor in graduate school. Her name's Leora Bressler, who's been an inspiration to me. And her humility, I think, as a teacher, her ability to, in the course of a class, hear from you at some point and then continually refer back to the student who contributed this or contributed that. There was always this sense that she really heard what you said because she kept referring back to it. And I try to do that. I call them callbacks. And then she was always curious and was not the expert, was really the learner all the time. Whenever I would say something or anyone in the classes would say things, she was interested in learning from the students. So those are two influential teachers. I have a wall of influential teachers in my office pictures, and they're two of the ones that are up on the wall. So those are probably my best examples. I've thought of some other authors that influenced me, but it's interesting. Neither of those were music teachers.
Yeah, and that's really unique to hear, especially the stories that they have had and how they've made an impact on you. Because a lot of times we will always say maybe who we had had some academic work with in our teacher training or in some musical aspects. So that's really unique to hear your response there, Philip. So now to wrap some things up with our last question, what advice would you give to music teachers to help their students best thrive?
Such a important question. I almost wanted to just say, love your students in the best sense of what we do as teachers. It's a form of love. As I said, we're in the business of people improvement. That's actually, I'm quoting someone, but I don't have his name right off the top of my head. But I think what I would say is that your students want to succeed. And they are, for the most part, making an effort towards that. And, back to the points that I was making about the self-determination theory and telling a student, you can do this, this is worth your time, and I'm here right beside you the whole way, I think are important. And one thing I stress with my students is incremental growth, incremental change is really worth celebrating. And if you're listening and watching and you see the students move the needle just a tiny notch and you go nuts because they've made some growth, that goes a long way to just, I think, reinvigorating their interest in doing more. And highlight the value of what they've done for them. You are music readers. You sound glorious. Your tone is gorgeous. And it's not because I want you to do this for me. I'm happy now that you've done it, or that the festival judges are going to be impressed. It's that you have a skill. You're going to, you'll be able to use your singing skills, your musicianship skills, your understanding of the world through this piece that we're singing. You're going to be able to benefit from those long after I'm done. You're outside of my purview. So that's my advice, is just care about those students in front of you and trust their desire to succeed, and notice when they do in the smallest of ways.
Lots of great points there, Philip. So with that said, that wraps up everything here in our interview. I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today, and all the best to you and your students as you continue out your spring semester.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
This concludes our episode. Many thanks to Dr. Philip Silvey for sharing his time, wisdom, and insight on the art of composing, and also on how to motivate and inspire students through the art of teaching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, and iHeartRadio, as well as looking up the show page on Facebook and liking our page under Director's Circle to stay updated on all future news and episodes. This is Doug Conrad saying thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in to the next edition of Director's Circle.